In this part, we're gonna work on Firebase authentication. So for this, you'll need to have a Google account, and once you're logged in, you need to go to console.firebase.google.com and create a new project. Let's name our project as expense tracker, and you need to accept the Firebase terms and hit continue. No, we don't want the Google Analytics. Okay, so the project is created, and now you will see this dashboard, and you need to click on this web icon. We need to create a web application, and let's name it as web app and register. So it will ask you to install the Firebase package, which we have done already, but if you haven't, just install it, and you need to copy this snippet. This will initialize the Firebase app into our application. So let's create a folder as config, and let's create a firebase.ts file and paste the configuration. Now this will create a Firebase app, and then we need to create a Firebase authentication service as well. And before we do that, we need to install a package that Firebase Auth uses. It's called React Native Async Storage, and Firebase Auth uses it to persist the user session. So we need that package. So let's just copy this and paste it here. Now let's run our application. Okay, so now we need to create the authentication service, and we need to import some functions from a Firebase/auth. So first we need to import initialize auth function. Then we need a function get React Native persistence. Okay, so just ignore this error. I will show you how you can fix this. Now we need to create the authentication. So let's create an auth variable and use initialize auth, and we need to pass the app variable, then some options. And here we need to define a property persistence, get React Native persistence. Now here we need to use the storage that we just installed. This will be async storage, which we haven't imported yet. So let's import this async storage from React Native async storage. Okay, so this is for authentication. So let's just add a comment here, auth. Now let's add a variable for our database. Let's add Firestore, and we need to import get Firestore function and pass the app variable. Okay, so now we need to fix this issue. This is a type issue. So let's go into TS configuration file, and here in the paths variable, we need to copy this line. This will hopefully fix the issue. So let's save it and go back. So there we can see the issue is gone. Now we need to create the Firestore database and email provider. So let's go into authentication and hit get started. Now you need to enable the email and password provider and hit save. And let's create a Firestore database. Create database, and let's choose the location. I'm gonna choose Singapore and hit next. Let's use a test mode for the sake of this application and hit create. Okay, so the database is created, and everything we store, we will see it here. Now we need to create a context to store the authenticated users. So let's create a folder contexts, and let's create a new file auth context. Okay, so now we need to import the create context API. Let's create an auth context and use the create context API. And let's give it a type of auth context type or null. and default value will be null. In this context, we will have the following values: user, set user, a login function to log in the user, and then a register function, and then update user data function. So as you can see, we have a user type. This is a custom type. So we will have a UID, an email, password, and image. So these are the types. So you can just copy these from here. Let's go back. And now let's create an auth provider. And this is gonna be a type of React dot functional component. And this will receive some children of type React dot React node, like this. And let's add the children. Okay, so first we're gonna have a user state where we will set our authenticated user, and by default this will be null. So let's use the type of user type that I've just shown you guys. So here you can see all the properties on this user type. Now we need to create a login function that we will use later. This will be an async function which will receive an email and the password of type string. Now inside this, let's create a try catch block, and this will give us an error if there is any. Then let's create a message from error.message, and if there is any error, we are gonna return a response with success as false, and the message will be from the error message. Now we're gonna use a function to log in the user, sign in with email and password. This is a function from Firebase /auth. We're gonna pass the authentication service that we created earlier, the email, and then the password. And once this is executed, we will log in the user and return the success as true. So this will be the login function. Now let's just copy this for the registration function and name this to register. Now this will receive email, password, and the name of the user as well. So let's add name of type string. Now let's just remove this, and we're gonna use a different method as create user with email and password. And this will give us the user object which will be created. So let's pass the authentication service, the email, and the password. Okay, so with this response, we will get a UID of the user, and we need to create a document of that user with the name that he provided. So let's use the setDoc function, which will create a document, and we need to provide the document reference. So let's use a doc function, and here we need to provide the database Firestore, then the name of the collection, which is users, and then the document ID. So we're gonna use the UID of the user as the document ID that we can get from response.user.uid. And let's add the data. So we need to add the data as email, the name, and the UID of this new user. So response.user.uid. And once this is created, we can return the success as true, and the user will be created in authentication, and it will be stored into database as well. So this is the register function. Now we need to create one more function to update the user data, and this will be update user data function. This will receive the UID. Now, this function is not for updating the user data into Firestore, but it's for updating the user state into our application. But if it doesn't make any sense right now, don't worry. I will explain when it's time to use this function. Now, let's just copy the code from register function, and let's remove this. Now, this is not gonna return this response. We will just simply console log the error message if there is any. And now we need to create a user reference that we're gonna update. So doc reference as the doc function, and let's use Firestore. And the Firestore is coming from the Firebase function that we created earlier. This is the database object. Now let's define the path as users and the UID that will pass to this function. Let's get the document snapshot. So we're gonna use get doc function and pass this document reference. Now we're gonna use the exist function on this doc snap to check if there is a document on this snapshot, and if there is any data, we will just update the state for this user. So if this is true, then inside this if statement, we will create the data, and we have the data function on this doc snap. Then we need to create the user data with a type of user type, and we're gonna have the values as UID. This will be data.uid. Then email, data.email. Then the name of the user, and then the image if there is an image, or null. Let's add null for all these values. Like this. So this will be the user data, and if there is a user data, we will just set it into the user state of this context. And I'll explain later why we need this function. So right now, if it doesn't make any sense, just don't worry about it. Okay, so now we need to create the context value. So let's create the context value and give it a type of auth context type. And this will have these following properties that I showed you guys before. So let's add the user, the set user, login, the register function, and the update user data function. Now let's return the auth context provider. So auth context, this needs to be capital. Okay, we made a mistake here. This needs to be capital auth context, like this. And let's change this to auth context dot provider, and let's add the value as context value. This needs to be context value. Okay, now let's render the children here. Okay, so auth context is done. Now we need to create a hook that will use this context. So let's create a use auth hook. Export const use auth, and this will return a type of auth context type. And let's get the context using the use context API and pass the auth context. Then if there is no context value, or if it's null, we are going to throw an error. This will say use auth must be wrapped inside an auth provider. But if it does have a value, then we will just simply return the context like this. Okay, so with this, our auth context is complete, and now we can use this inside the register screen to create a new user and see if it's working. So let's go into the register component. And here we need to remove all of this. And first we need to start the loading. So let's set is loading to true. And we'll get the response from this register API, which we need to get from this use auth hook. Let's use the use auth and get this register function. Let's just change this to register user. This makes more sense. So register user, and we need to pass the values as email, password, and the name of the user. Now let's save this, and now we need to check if we are getting any error from this response. Um, okay, so we are getting this error because we did not wrap our layout with the auth context provider. So let's export a new root layout, and we need to return our auth provider. So let's import the auth provider from our context, and here we need to add the stack layout, and let's change this layout to the stack layout. And let's just remove this because we no longer need to export this. Let's save this, and hopefully let's just reload the application. Okay, so now we don't see any error. That's a good sign. Okay, so now let's get back to the register component, and here we need to console log the register result from this API. Then we need to make a check here if the result.success is false. That means we got an error, and in that case we will just alert the user with that error. So this will say sign up, and here we will render the result dot message like this. And after the API we need to set the is loading state to false like this. Now let's save this. Okay, now let's just reload the application and see if everything is working. Let's go to sign up. Let's create our first account, and hit sign up. Okay, so we can see in the console register result as success true. So that means our register API is working and the user is created. Now we need to be able to move to the main app. So for that we need to create a new group for the tabs, and let's create all the tabs here. Index.tsx, this will be the home tab. So let's create a functional component. Let's rename this to home. Now let's create other tabs as we're gonna have a profile tab. Let's create a functional component, change the name. Then let's create a wallet tab to manage all the wallets for this user. And finally, we're gonna have a statistics tab. So this is where the user will see statistics by weekly, monthly, and yearly duration. And let's save this. Now we're gonna create a layout file to define this is a tab layout. So we need to create the tabs layout from Expo router. So let's just type tabs, and there we go. So let's just save this, and hopefully this will work. Now we need to be able to move to this tab layout when we sign up or log in, and we can do that in auth context. So here we need to define a use effect hook where we will listen for authentication state changes. Now Firebase provides us with a hook that's called onAuth state changed, and that is triggered every time user logs in, logs out, or signs up. We need to pass the authentication service, and this will return a Firebase user in a callback. And using that, we can know if the user is logged in, signed up, or if he logged out. So here, let's just console log this user to see what data we are getting from this listener. Let's save this. So now let me just reload and do a sign up again. So here you can see by default the Firebase user is null. Now if I create a new account, let's see what happens. And if I hit sign up, the success is true, but the Firebase user is null. Let's see in the Firebase console. So this is the Firebase database, and we have a users collection. And we also have two users that we just created. Let's go into authentication, and we can see our users here, but why can't we see them here? Oh, okay. This needs to be Firebase user. We are displaying the user from the auth context. Okay, so now we can see we have the Firebase user that we just created. We have the UID, and we also should have an email. So there we have the email for this user. Let me just minimize this, and let's just remove this. And here we need to make a condition. If there is a Firebase user, in that case, we want to set this to our user state in this context. And we're going to have the values as the UID and then the email. And then we're going to have a name. So Firebase user has this display name property, which we can use that. So if there is no user, we are going to set this user to null, because that will mean if there is no user or user just logged out. So when we set the user, we also need to move the user to the tabs layout. So let's define the router to navigate to the tabs, and we're gonna replace the current route so that user can't go back to the previous route once he's logged in. So we will replace the current route with the tabs layout, and if the user logs out, then we're gonna replace the current route with the welcome route so that he can not go back to the dashboard. And now we need to return this unsubscribe function from this listener, and let's save this. So there we can see the tabs layout, and we move to the welcome page. And this is because in the index page we have this set timeout that after 2 seconds we move to welcome page. So let's just remove this now because we don't need it now. So let's just reload, and after the splash screen we move to tabs layout. That means we are logged in. That's why we are seeing these pages, so we can see all the tabs. So now we need to be able to see what happens when there is no user. So we need a way to log out, and let's add a button in the home tab to log out the user. Let's import the button, and inside this let's add typo, and this will say log out. Let's save this. So there we can see the button. Let's change the text to black like this. Let's save this. So now when we click this, we should be able to log out. So let's add on press method, and this will trigger handle logout function. So let's create this function here. This will be an async function. We're gonna use a function a sign out from Firebase. So let's await for sign out, and we need to pass the auth service for this to work. So let's import the auth from Firebase file, and let's save this. Now let me just open the terminal and see how the user state will change. So let's just console log the Firebase user here and see what happens when we log out the user. So let's save this. So for now we can see we have the Firebase user. If I just reload, there you can see we have the Firebase user. And let's see what happens when I log out. Okay, so we move to welcome page and the Firebase user is null, and we set the user to null and change the routes to welcome screen, and we can see we are on the welcome page. So authentication is working. Now let's create a new user and see everything works smoothly. Hit sign up, and we move to tabs layout. So there we can see we have the Firebase user now. Now let me just log out, and now we need to work on our login screen. Our sign up is page is working. So let me just go to the login, and let's just minimize this, and let's just remove this console log. First, we need to set the is loading to true, and then we need to get the login function from our use auth hook. Let's call it login user, and let's get the response from this API. We need to pass the email and the password, and let's set the loading to false, and let's make a condition. If there is if the success is false, then there must be an error, and in that case let's just alert the user with that error, result dot message, like this. And let's save this. So let's reload the application and see if the login is working. Let me just try with wrong credentials to see if we are getting the error messages as well. So if I log in with the wrong email, this says error auth slash invalid credentials, but this does not look very human friendly. So we need to change this message. So let's go into our auth context, and here where we are getting this message, we need to console log this message, error message, like this. Let's also copy this for the register function, because we might need to change the register function errors. So let's go to login. So let's use the wrong credentials again. Okay, so we need to copy this, and we will make a condition here. If the error says this, if the message includes this error, auth slash invalid credentials, if that is true, then we need to change the message to wrong credentials. That looks more human friendly. Let's save this, and now let's see what happens. So this time I will enter a wrong password. So let's hit login. There you can see our custom error message. So let's see what happens when I enter an invalid email. So if I just remove the @ symbol and hit login, we get another weird error message. We need to change this as well. So let's just copy this, and let's copy this message. And if we get this message, then we'll change this to invalid email, like this, and let's save this. Okay, so let's test again if this is working. And let me just remove this @ symbol and hit login. There we can see our custom message. Now let me log in with my correct email and password. And there we go, we are logged into the application. So now we need to test the sign up errors. So let's just log out, go to sign up, and let's see what happens if I create an account with the same email. So let's sign up. So we need to change these errors as well. Also, let's just copy these emails, these errors, in case if we get any error from either of these. So let's just copy this one. And we're not gonna get invalid credentials from sign up. So let's just change this. And this message will say this email is already in use. Let's save this. And let's see if this is working. So let's go to sign up, and let's again create an account with an existing email. Let's sign up, and there we can see this error message. So the errors are working, the sign up and the login is working. And now I want to show you one more issue that we have with our authentication context. So remember when we created a method update user data into the auth context? Now it's time to use that function. So let me show you why we need that function. Let me just log in. Okay, we are logged in, and let's focus on our terminal. So if I console log the user data from our use auth hook, let's import the user from use auth hook and console log it here. Okay, so there you can see in the console we have the email, name, and the UID, and you can see the name is null. But I remember when we created this user, we also added a name for each user. So you can see in the Firebase database, for each document we have the name property as well. But this is not showing in here because this is the authentication state. It's not the document from the database. So that's where this function will come, and we need to call it as soon as we log in the user, and that will update the user state from the user document. So let's call this function here. We need to pass the UID that we can get from the firebase.uid. So this function will get the updated user data, and then it will create the user data and update in user state. That way we will get the updated data. Now let's just save this and go to home tab. Oh, as I saved this, you can see it updated the user state, and now we have the image, the name, and the UID. So now we are getting the updated data from the Firebase or Firestore database, and we can use this anywhere in our application, and this will persist even if we reload the application. So there you can see it just updated the name and the image from the database. So with this, our authentication system is complete. And in the next part, we're going to create a custom tab bar UI.